Clean, fresh water is essential for human life and human communities. However, more than 1 billion people lack access to water, and 2.7 billion people experience water scarcity at least once a month every year. By 2025, 2/3 of the world's population may be facing water shortages. Without urgent action, this water insecurity can cause mass migration that could destabilize regions, exacerbate internal and international conflicts, and even lead to wars. To discuss the global challenges related to water insecurity, WE3 is so pleased to be joined by two absolute experts in the field. Dr. Carolyn Kissane is the director of NYU's Center for Global Affairs. Dr. Kissane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
And we are also so pleased to be joined by Admiral Eric Olson, who during his distinguished military career served as the commander for U.S. Special Operations Command and was a Navy SEAL. Admiral Olson, thank you for coming back and joining us at WE3 this year.
Thank you, Chris, and great to be with Carolyn.
Well, as I mentioned at the top, the two of you have a absolutely bird's eye view of how water insecurity is impacting global stability. And as means of introduction, I want to ask a principles question to both of you. And I'll have Dr. Kissane, Carolyn, I'll have you go first. When government, military, academic, and business leaders think about global challenges over the next 30 plus years, where does the water energy nexus rank in terms of concern and why?
Thank you, Chris. It's a great question. And just a quick shout out to all of you at Zpryme for putting this together. It's just really important, critical conversations. And again, it's an honor to be sharing this virtual stage with Admiral Olson. I think to answer that question really does depend, right? So just even in the description that you gave of this conversation, if you are someone who lives in a water-stressed area today, that it's it's one of your top priorities. So for different governments around the world, the water security issue is different. For some, it is, as I said, the #1 priority, and for others, it is not. When we look out at the next 30 years, we are facing, great uncertainty. We're facing sort of a lot of disruptions that are going to exacerbate the water stress that we already see. And I think also, if you are a business, and your operations focus on beverages, food, right? Then water is a critical part of your lifeline. So I do think it really does vary. I think what we have seen and we're witnessing where sort of the water energy nexus is becoming a much more sort of part of both when we think about when we think about security, when we think about national security issues, it's a much deeper thread than it was even 10 years ago. And I think, it's really important to also recognize that, even here in the United States, and yesterday I heard on, one of the panels, right? If you're in California, sort of water stress is much closer to you than if you're, for example, just before getting started, Admiral Olson was saying Florida has a lot of water, right? New York, we don't necessarily sort of feel that insecurity when it comes to our water, but it's really regionally varied. And I think it's really important to highlight that, because we also sort of need to be thinking about different types of solutions. But I am sort of very confident that the water energy nexus and the issue of water insecurity when we think out over the next 30 years is going to sort of move up with regards to priorities. It's inevitable, it has to. And, I think the, instability that we've seen, the the experiences we've seen just over the last year, I think really sort of show that we have to be better prepared, and we can't sort of wait until we can't wait until it's urgent that we take action. We really have to be thinking much more forward and sort of preparing and thinking about what we know will happen, but sort of taking the explicit action now and over the next 30 years to alleviate in the ways that we can the growing insecurities that we're seeing and will see.
Well, thank you so much, Carolyn. And I want to, have Admiral Olson pick up on so many of those themes, and I'm sure you will. Dr. Kissane touched on the security implications, the international and the national security implications. So turning this back over to you, where does the water energy nexus rank in terms of concerns and why?
First, if you're going to call Dr. Kissane Carolyn, please call me Eric, not Admiral Olson. It's my pleasure to be with you. And I agree with everything she said. This is a top level concern. It needs to be a top level concern. Water and energy are two of life's essentials. We simply cannot survive in any way without water, and we can't survive in any way that we've become accustomed to without sufficient energy. There's growing population, mostly in the less developed regions where access to clean water and sufficient energy are already a problem. A key element of the nexus is that it requires water to make most clean energy, and it requires energy to make most clean water. They work together in sync. And as you said, maybe a third of the world doesn't have access to clean water today, maybe half of the world. Half of the people in the world who are sick today are sick because of waterborne microbial diseases. Clinics and hospitals require both sufficient energy and clean water. And back when I was in the Special Operations Forces, and we asked the leaders in the most remote villages of Afghanistan, for example, what we could provide to help them, water and energy were at the top of their list, followed by medical supplies and information behind water and energy. So this together, water and energy separately and as a nexus, affect where people live and affect how they live. In some cases, affects whether they live. It affects their trust in their governments, their level of education, their agriculture. Where there are rivers and lakes, it affects their fishing and their transportation directly. The ability to provide or withhold water and energy give power, give authority to the people and governments that own them. There's a weaponization of water and energy that can occur to create intimidation and fear or to grant privilege. Think of the international borders that are defined by water supplies. Think of the Indus River, the Litani in southern Lebanon, the Nile and the Amazon, even the Colorado and the Rio Grande between us and Mexico, with huge international implications. Huge migrations have been caused by government control of water. And perhaps the starkest example was the diversion of the rivers that fed the Aral Sea on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Over about 50 years, the rivers were siphoned off for other agricultural needs within the Soviet Union. And the Aral Sea, which at one time was the world's fourth largest freshwater lake, essentially dried up. It had less than 10% of its volume. It was highly saline. It was highly acidic. It was highly polluted in every way. The fishing industry died. The villages had to move. The nomads took it off their route, and cultures essentially disappeared as a result of the disappearance of the Aral Sea, and that was based on government decisions to do that. And now a fleet of ships sits on their bottoms on the dry lake bed where the Aral Sea used to be. So And the reality is that almost all water is polluted at or near its source. So bottled water, by some accounts, more than $80 billion plastic bottles a year of all sizes, has then created its own series of cascading disasters, including pollution of the oceans, traceable back to pollution of drinking water at its source. And a reason that this is also serious is that no country can solve its water and energy challenges on its own. It requires regional and global cooperation and coordination, and this has proved to be difficult always and impossible often. Back to you.
Mm. So many great points that both of you brought up, and truly for our audience, I strongly encourage you to Google photos of the Aral Sea. And I mean, as Eric mentioned, you can see just ships on dry land. You can see where villages used to be up against the water's edge, and there is no water to be seen in the photo because it's gone. So it's a tragic occurrence. You mentioned that no country can do this on their own, and that is absolutely right. Even here in North America, in the United States, our biggest source of fresh water, the Great Lakes, is managed and controlled through the International Joint Commission that Canadian and representatives from the United States sit on. So this is a global problem, and as Carolyn mentioned, I'm going to try. It's a little weird. You both deserve the formality, but you're both wonderful, friendly folks, and so I'm going to try to be informal with you on this conversation. But as Carolyn mentioned, this isn't just an international issue. This is something that we have to think about in the United States. The three of us happen to be sitting in places without true the traditional forms of water insecurity, but many of our country men and women do face that, and how that impacts the future of our country over the next 80 years is going to be determined. Carolyn, I want to turn to you and bring it back to the international realm. Feel free to touch on the domestic side as well, but what are some of the most significant international security challenges related to the water energy nexus?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I think Eric really sort of highlighted many of them, right? That we could go each of them into much greater depth. I did all of my graduate research, dissertation research in Kazakhstan, and I've spent many years in Central Asia, and I'm very close to the Aral Sea issue, and sort of seeing the devastation, and much of it was done because of policy, right? In terms of, sort of the Soviet Union sort of thinking that it could have control over nature, right? To sort of divert water and the salination. It's, massive disaster. Also in Central Asia, right? So Eric, since you brought us to Central Asia, I think a really interesting issue, and I agree with Eric in terms of that we need cooperation and we need country to country cooperation. But I think oftentimes when countries are thinking about their own energy security and their own sort of national security, because energy is so important for economic growth, right? Eric talked about health, education, right? If you're going to make an investment in a country, you really want that country to have reliable access to electricity, right? It's going to be important for your own operations. So if you look at a country such as Ethiopia, right? So when they're building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right, which is very important for Ethiopia's own security, energy security, but also as it sort of thinks over the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades into the future to have reliable access to electricity and to expand energy access for all. But if you're Egypt and you're the downstream country, you see that as a threat to your security, because you see that that's potentially going to limit your water access, right? And it's going to then sort of incur challenges on your own agricultural production. We see the same thing in Tajikistan, right? So in Tajikistan, which is very, very energy poor, right? But it exists in a region where you have countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, which are considered to be relatively energy rich. But when Tajikistan decides to build a dam, the Rogan Dam, Uzbekistan says, you build it and we go to war, right? They have threatened war over the construction of the Rogan Dam. I think it is important, given the fact that the title of this conversation is Water Wars, is we can all sort of stop and think, well, how many water wars have there been? We haven't really had wars over water, but there's a long list of conflicts that are attributed to water. And water, as Eric pointed out, has been weaponized. It's oftentimes a target in war. If you just look at Iraq and Afghanistan as two really primary examples in terms of how water has been used and has been weaponized. So I think that's really important. Also, when you think about sort of two very, very like strong cases, right? Syria. So if you look at the sort of the years leading up to the Syrian Civil War, which is still, it's ongoing. You had people who were moving from their places where they had agricultural production into cities, right? That the droughts that were happening in Syria were part of the, I would call it like one of the drivers of the Syrian Civil War, not the driver, but again, in a kind of one of the variables. And the same thing with the Arab Spring, right? It's really interesting when you look at the Arab Spring and you say, like, there were droughts in Russia, there were droughts in Argentina that limited wheat production, that then caused an increase in food prices, bread prices, right? That then, brought people out to the streets in Libya and Egypt and many other parts of the Arab world, right? So there's this connection to food security, to hunger, to livelihoods. It's any place I look in the world. So, even sort of going back to your first question. So as an academic who teaches energy, environment, resource security, these are issues that are top in my mind and many of my colleagues who do similar work. But I think there's a greater sort of recognition of that, how water and how limited access to water is a real destabilizer, and we see it, and we'll again we are going to see more of it. Eric talked about migration. I really encourage everyone. I think it was in July of this past summer, the New York Times and ProPublica did this really exquisite article on the Great Migration, and it was looking at specifically at Central America, Guatemala, and sort of looking at how droughts, how changes in precipitation, changes in sort of their agricultural lands was driving people to leave, that they could not feed their families. They had no other choice but to leave, and how that is exacerbating migration to the north, right? And this is, again, these are significant security challenges that require a much more sort of broad, thoughtful. It requires lots of different people to be at the table, lots of different groups to be at the table. It requires a lot of cooperation. But I think in terms of water and international security, again, I think it would be really hard to sort of look at any part of the world and not sort of see how water is both a source of security if you have enough of it, but is a source of insecurity. And I also encourage, there's a wonderful, I always share it with my students, is the Chronology of Water Conflicts. And it's published by the Pacific Institute. It's pretty extraordinary what they've put together, because you can kind of see the different ways water has been sort of connected to conflict, whether very directly or indirectly. So, when I think of international security, I think very first and foremost about access to water, because as Eric also pointed out, it's critical to our lives. It's critical to having a quality of life that, you know, we have access to food, we have access to clean water. That's just, again, I think something that, you know, we constantly need to be considering. And maybe the last thing I would say is that, you know, kind of going to, we talked about the RLC. China has one of the largest water diversion projects that's ever happened, the South to North Water Diversion Project, and that's really important for China's, you know, security. But we also sort of see, in terms of dam building, that you know, dams that are being built in Vietnam, or Eric talked about the Mekong Delta. Like these are significant challenges that involve not just one country but many countries. So many of the water cooperation agreements that we've seen that have been made, some of them are getting stressed, right? That there's been cooperation, or that there's been some level of cooperation, but questions as to whether or not they will sort of remain, be able to still hold up under new levels of water stress.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Just a very thorough but quick round the world tour of all of these potential hotspots of water insecurity. And a point that you made is that it's not just the on the surface impact, that there can be, pardon the pun here, but some downstream effects. And that kind of leads me to bringing Eric back into this conversation, because last year at WE3, you shared an absolutely fascinating slide that explored both positive and negative forces that impact global stability. Everything on the negative side, from everything from the movement of terrorism and illegal narcotics, to some of the good side, the movement of people and goods around the world. How does water impact regional and global conflicts from your perspective?
That's huge, and the slide you're talking about was sort of how the world works in a post-Cold War, post 9/11 environment, and what it meant to highlight was emerging factors that are of real importance to how people and nations behave independently and with each other, and those are factors like climate change and pandemic diseases and terrorism and cyberism and persecution by governments and transnational crime and the rise of state and non-state actors and shifting demographics and the technology revolutions in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and quantum computing. But it included and it highlighted energy and water. And the purpose of all of this, I mean, this is all in the context of, if these are all rising factors in their importance, and if some of them at least have national security implications, and I can make a case that they do, and if militaries of the world are an instrument available to governments for dealing with national security issues, then what, if any, is the role of militaries in dealing with these emerging factors, to include the water energy nexus? And if there is a role, how do you prepare them to do it? It's an open question, and I think that many countries are struggling with how to use the capabilities available to them to deal with these issues.
Time has just flown by so quickly, and we've had great questions from the audience. And I'm going to try to encapsulate them all into this sort of last question, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but there will be a chance, of course, for future networking throughout the course of this day. But as the two of you think about this, and Carolyn, I'm going to have you go first, and then Eric, I'll give you the last word. Too often we think about these global challenges without addressing some of the concrete solutions that we can be taking. And that's what some of the comments have been in the chat. What are some of the most important steps governments, military, business leaders can take to mitigate some of the most harmful effects of climate change and water energy insecurity? We could spend another hour on this, but maybe just one or two at the most.
I was going to say that's courses, right? That's multiple semesters we need really to do it adequately. Yeah, so I think many of the conversations that have been happening during WE3 are examples of those solutions. That's why I really commend you for doing this, because we've been talking, Eric and I have been talking about many of the challenges, right? But there are some really extraordinary, innovative things happening. And I think that this is becoming more of a priority. So when you look at businesses, they see it as, their bottom line is at stake, right? They need to be, if water is important, and I think there's so much happening that's shifting in the financial world. So if you look at, for example, BlackRock, right? $7 trillion that they manage, and they're really pushing climate change. So across all of the companies that they are invested in, to make sure that those companies are considering climate change. You sort of go back to Mark Carney and his the tragedy on the horizon. So this is becoming, I think, really a big part of how companies don't see it as an add-on. They see it as, they need to be thinking about climate change. They need to be thinking about their supply chain. And I think that's a really significant shift. And also in my space in energy, I think, we're seeing that there's much more much more attention to the types of investments that are being made. And you see it in terms of the move away from coal. And I think the whole water management space is fascinating in terms of how new technologies are emerging to help better manage, more efficiently manage water. And also in agriculture, I think there's so many new technologies, regenerative agriculture. I could go on, but I'm glad that we're thinking about the solutions, because there are many, and it requires multiple stakeholders to be involved.
That's a great answer, Eric. Last thoughts to you.
Yeah, I'll pile on a little bit. I think each of us can learn more. We can teach more. We can promote and support education that matters in this regard in our communities and even in our amongst our family and friends. I think we can vote to elect officials who are more likely to be part of the solution, and then hold them accountable for working with each other and across party aisles, and working with our international partners. I think we can, as a nation, put pressure on international organizations like the United Nations to do the right thing and be party to the many pacts and treaties and agreements that are emerging as important in this. I think business leaders can drive company policies in these regards with sustainability and those sorts of issues as drivers of how they manage. And I'd like to, I think, use my last few seconds to highlight Smart Energy Water, who, working with you at Zpryme, is conducting this forum for the purpose of doing exactly some of that, to get the word out, to get people engaged, to drive follow-on conversations, to make us think about it in a different way. And I think Deepak Garg and his leadership of Smart Energy Water is powerful in this regard. And what Smart Energy Water does, which is manage power and energy around the world for more efficient use, less waste, and better monitorship of all of that. And then I'll also highlight Manoj Bhargava and Living Essentials, Enhanced Power and Water, and some of the things they're doing, developing disruptive technologies to localize efficient energy production and water purification in a way that ultimately will bring relief in some of these most remote places where they need it so badly. So thanks for having me with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Eric, Carolyn, thank you both. And Eric, what a great way to end the conversation, highlighting to companies, to individuals, and that are absolutely on the front edge of this challenge and overcoming this challenge. So thank you for highlighting them. Thank you both for your expertise and your wisdom. I hope that you have safe and good holidays. As we wrap up this session, we are going into a group networking for all general admission attendees from 11 to 11:45 Central Time. The link is on the main landing page and is labeled 11 a.m. group networking. And this, of course, will lead you directly to that. And then please do come back for another fantastic fireside chat with CPS's Paula Gold-Williams and Zpryme CEO Jason Rodriguez at noon Central. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.